In January 2015, a 16-year-old boy from Drammen, Norway, signed for Real Madrid. The press conference was broadcast live across Europe. Journalists wrote that he was better at 16 than Messi had been, that he was going to be the best player in the world. He played 39 minutes for Real Madrid's first team in 5 years. The world called it one of the great wasted talents of his generation. A cautionary tale about hype and young players moved too soon. That same person is now captain of Arsenal and captain of Norway. He led Norway to their first World Cup quarterfinal in 28 years, with 4 assists along the way. So what happened between those two versions of Martin Ødegaard? And why does a Danish philosopher who died in 1855 have the most convincing answer? Søren Kierkegaard would have called what happened at Real Madrid something completely different. He would have called it the beginning. Martin Ødegaard grew up in Drammen, a small city outside Oslo. By 15, he was already playing professional football for Strømsgodset in the Norwegian top flight. Not youth football, professional football. He was the youngest player the league had ever seen. Real Madrid sent scouts. Bayern Munich sent scouts. Half of Europe sent scouts. And then Real Madrid signed him, and the machine of expectation took over completely. Magazine covers, documentary crews. The world had decided who Martin Ødegaard was going to be before he had any idea himself. He spent 5 years there without ever becoming a first-team player. Loan spell after loan spell. Heerenveen, Vitesse, Real Sociedad, where he finally showed flashes of something real. And then Arsenal, in January 2021. And something shifted. Within weeks, it was obvious this was not the same player who had bounced around Europe looking for somewhere to belong. He was sharper, calmer, more himself. Arsenal signed him permanently that summer and made him captain the following year. The question worth asking is not what went wrong at Real Madrid. The question is what went right. Søren Kierkegaard was born in Copenhagen in 1813, the youngest of 7 children, raised by a deeply religious and melancholic father. He grew up anxious and intense, convinced that life contained some truth he had not yet been able to reach. He never held a university position. He wrote constantly, often under pseudonyms, arguing with himself as much as with the world. And he became the philosopher who, more than anyone else, asked the question that Ødegaard's career eventually had to answer. How does a person become who they actually are? Kierkegaard believed human existence moved through 3 stages. The first he called the aesthetic stage, living for pleasure, for excitement, for the surface of things. The prodigy who loves being called a prodigy. It feels like living, but nothing in it is truly chosen. It is all just happening. The second stage he called the ethical stage. This is where things get harder. The aesthetic stops working. The identity the world gave you stops fitting. And you are left with a question you cannot ignore. Who am I when no one is projecting anything onto me? Kierkegaard called the feeling that arrives at this stage despair. Not sadness exactly, but the specific ache of not yet being yourself. And then the third stage, the leap. You cannot reason your way into becoming yourself. At some point you simply have to choose and commit and trust. Kierkegaard called it the leap of faith. He also wrote something that sounds simple but takes a lifetime to understand. Life can only be understood backwards, but it must be lived forwards. Go back through Ødegaard's career and it maps onto Kierkegaard's stages almost perfectly. Real Madrid was the aesthetic stage. The hype, the press conference, the documentary cameras, the magazine covers. He was 16 years old and the world had already decided he was special. That felt like everything. But it was just the surface. Nothing there was truly his. The talent was his, yes, but the identity was not. It had been built by scouts and journalists and a club that needed a story, and he was living inside someone else's idea of who he was. The lone years were the ethical stage. Stripped of the hype, playing in leagues no one was watching, asking himself week after week why the thing that was supposed to come naturally was not coming. That is exactly the despair Kierkegaard was writing about. Not failure in the ordinary sense, something more specific and more important. The moment when the identity you were given stops working and you have no replacement yet. When you have to sit with the question of who you are without anyone telling you the answer. Most people try to escape that feeling as fast as possible. They chase the next thing, the next loan, the next promise. Ødegaard sat inside it long enough to come out the other side. And Arsenal was the leap. Not because Arsenal was the obvious destination for someone who had been at Real Madrid, but because at Arsenal, for the first time, he stopped trying to be the player the world had decided he was at 16 and just played, the way you play when you know who you are. Kierkegaard said that the self is not something you find, it is something you become, and you can only become it by going through the stages, not around them. The years at Real Madrid were not wasted. They were the aesthetic stage running its course. The loans were not failure. They were the despair that Kierkegaard said you have to feel before you can get to the other side. And the captain's armband at Arsenal and Norway at the World Cup. Ødegaard at 27, 4 assists, playing with the calm of someone who knows exactly who he is. That is what the other side looks like. The way football talks about young talent is almost designed to skip Kierkegaard's stages. We identify a prodigy, project a destiny onto them, and then measure everything against that projection. If it does not match, we call it failure. We write the cautionary tale. But Kierkegaard would say, the cautionary tale is usually the story of someone who never got lost enough to find themselves. The real story is always the person who did get lost, who sat in the despair long enough, who made the leap without knowing where they would land. Ødegaard at 16 was a talent inside an identity built for him by other people. The years that looked like failure were the years where that identity quietly came apart until what was left was just him. Kierkegaard wrote, "The most common form of despair is not being who you are." Ødegaard spent several years in that despair, and then he stopped. Søren Kierkegaard died in 1855 at 42 years old, still writing, still arguing, still asking the question of how a person becomes who they are. He never got to see a Norwegian footballer live out his answer across a decade of professional football, but he would have recognized the arc completely. The 39 minutes at Real Madrid were not the point. The loans were not the detour. They were the stages, every one of them necessary, every one of them the only way to get to what came after. Kierkegaard said life can only be understood backwards. Looking back at Ødegaard's career now, it is one of the clearest illustrations of that idea that football has ever produced. If this is the kind of football you want to think about, there's more where this came from. Subscribe and we'll keep going.